And if I told you that Hamilton's accident in Zandvoort was not his fault, but a consequence of a hidden failure in the SF25 that Ferrari did not want to admit to the beginning? What if I also reveal that there were unauthorized alterations in your car before the classification? The 2025 Grand Prix was called to be a perfect opportunity for Ferrari to reaffirm his technical solidity, and for Lewis Hamilton, already in his third race dressed in red, he began to consolidate his new stage as a pillar of the Maranello project. Zandvoort, with its aware curves, narrow sectors and a volatile climate, does not forgive mistakes, but either forgives technical improvisations. And what happened in Curve 3 of that circuit goes beyond what many believe to see in the repetition of the incident. The day dawned with dense fog and an intermittent rain that completely altered the adhesion references of the path. The teams began working with more conservative motor maps and less aggressive suspension settings, knowing that each curve would be a potential trap. However, nothing seemed to indicate that something extraordinary was going to happen, at least not from outside. When the traffic light went out, Hamilton had a clean start without shocks. He avoided the usual chaos of the first curves, maintained his position and seemed to have entered into rhythm, until it reached the Curve 3. A turn in ascending Perrault, where pilots usually play with partial acceleration to stabilize traction, especially in wet conditions. It was there that, without prior notice, SF25 number 44 lost the rear. Hamilton's correction was immediate, fast, instinctive. But it wasn't enough. The car crossed completely and ended up hitting the barriers. At first glance, it looked like a spin caused by excess gas, perhaps a bad line choice or a calculation error in torque delivery. But the car data, and above all Ferrari's later reaction, told a very different story. Immediately, the cameras focused on the box of the Italian team. Long faces were not just because of abandonment. It was evident that something did not square in the narrative. Fred Vasseur, visibly upset, avoided committing in his first statements, just saying that there would be any anomaly. But the cold tone and the lack of a clear defense towards Hamilton were a revealing symptom. Comments on social networks and specialized media did not wait. An error of the 7-time world champion? A rookie slip in a new car? None of that made sense, especially when the initial data showed that Hamilton had not applied an atypical acceleration or exceeded the usual traction limit. It was as if the car had reacted on its own, without mechanical logic or correlate with the pilot's action. That detail was the trigger for what would come later. A seemingly routine accident became a crack inside Ferrari, a turning point that would not only leave a critical technical failure exposed, but also open the door to internal tensions, sabotage theories and decisions that would change the course of the season for the team and for its brand new star pilot. What seemed like a simple mistake ended up revealing a much deeper conflict. And this time the enemy was not out, but inside Maranello. To what extent can an accident be the symptom of a structure on the edge of the collapse? When the remains of Lewis Hamilton SF25 were returned to Zandvoort paddock, a counter-relage race began. What was initially reported as a minor accident by the team was soon re-evaluated behind closed doors with a silent but evident alarm. Ferrari activated his incident analysis protocol with an urgency that contradicted his public statements. Maranello's technicians were not just checking superficial damage or looking for the pilot errors. They were trying to unravel a failure that they already suspected that it was not new, one that could have been incubated weeks without having manifested. And what they found was more worrying about what anyone inside the team was willing to admit out loud. Telemetry data were the first to turn on the alarms. The torque distribution system of the rear axle had delivered an asymmetric torque sequence at the most critical traction moment, just at the exit of Curve 3. The preliminary conclusion was disconcerting. The power delivery had been unequal between the rear wheels. The car had behaved as if each wheel lived in its own universe, as if the SF25 had had two different brains acting at the same time, one on each rear axle. The cause? An intermittent failure in the calibration of electronic differential, linked to an error in the software mapping. The electronic differential is in charge of managing how much power is distributed to each rear wheel according to the level of grip, the curve speed, the steering angle, and the state of the asphalt. When it works correctly, it is an engineering masterpiece that allows pilots to maximize the passage through curve without losing stability. But when it fails, it transforms an elite car into a deadly trap with wheels. The most disturbing was not the failure itself. It was discovering that this erratic behavior could have been latent since the pre-season, undercover due to stable climatic conditions and less demanding circummatic conditions in terms of lateral traction. In other words, it was not a new problem. It was a time bomb that simply found in Zandvoort the perfect stage to explode. Riccardo Adami, Hamilton's career engineer, broke the silence with an explosive confession. On Friday prior to the classification in Zandvoort, Hamilton had reported positive sensations with the car. The SF25 was stable, balanced, predictable. An ideal scenario to build a competitive weekend. However, upon Saturday morning, everything had changed. The same car, under the same track conditions, behaved erratically. Lewis reported an unstable rear axle, constant survival in slow outputs, and a chronic inability to generate traction in low adhesion areas. It seemed another car. Adami investigated the data and found the unthinkable. The car had been altered without his knowledge or that of the pilot himself. Specifically, the rear handling height and the preload of the differential had been modified. Two variables that define the dynamic behavior of the car in curve. Two parameters that, if they fit without a correlation with the general car settings, can convert a car into an unpredictable machine. The most serious thing was that Charles Leclerc's car had not suffered any modification. His configuration remained intact since Friday, which allowed him to build a solid classification and a career without shocks. The difference in the treatment between the two cars became evident not only in the times on track, but also in body language inside the garage. A divided box with two work philosophies that seemed to operate in parallel, without communication or consensus. Adami demanded answers. The chain of responsibilities within Ferrari pointed to the central simulation group of Maranello, an engineer's cell that works remotely and makes technical decisions based on simulation algorithms and predictive models. This cell had recommended and executed changes in Hamilton's car without validating its impact with the track team. The justification was even more disconcerting. The data suggested that the adjustment would improve the behavior of the car in medium curve under low load conditions. But those same data completely ignored the specific climatic conditions of Zandvoort and, worse, Hamilton's pilot style, based on a soft entry and an aggressive output. The result was a car incompatible with its way of driving. The consequences soon materialized. Rumors were leaked that some technicians had begun to write renunciation letters. Adami threatened to leave the team if the classic coordination procedures between Maranello and the box were not restored. Vasseur, pressed from Ferrari's board of directive, was forced to freeze any intervention of the central group in career configurations until new notice. The crisis was no longer only technical or sports. It was political. The Hamilton accident in Zandvoort, which in the eyes of the world seemed a simple error in rain, has turned out to be a window towards a much deeper technical and structural problem within Ferrari. We are not talking only about a loss of traction or an electronics failure. We are talking about the temporary collapse of the relationship between the pilot and his machinery. And worse, the collapse of trust between the different arms of a team that remains trapped in its eternal duality, avant-garde and corridor policy engineering. This incident has exposed the fragility of Ferrari's internal validation systems, the lack of a unified protocol between the track technicians and the central group in Maranello, and the dangerous disconnection between the predictive simulations and the reality of the track. In the modern era of Formula One, where margins are microscopic and technical decisions are taken with surgical precision, an error like this is not tolerable. Much less when he calls into question the reputation of a 7-time world champion. Ferrari's reaction, although fast, was also reactive. No preventive decisions were made. It acted because a car had already crashed, because the damage was already done. The Hamilton accident was the final result of a series of cumulative failures that should have been detected and corrected much earlier. And this raises an inevitable question. If a team like Ferrari, with the resources it possesses, is able to ignore such a critical anomaly, what other things are failing below the radar? But the most worrying of this episode is its potential to leave scars. Not only in the results sheet, but in the relationship between Hamilton and Ferrari. Because, although Lewis has been diplomatic in his public statements, he has internally demanded structural changes. And if Ferrari does not respond with clear, consistent and forceful decisions, it runs the risk of this being the principle of an irreparable fracture. This is where the viewer also enters the scene. Because now is the time to ask, can Ferrari recover the technical and political course before it is too late? Is Hamilton ready to be the architect of that reconstruction? Or will he simply be another victim of Maranello's instability? And how will the rivals respond, now that they have closely witnessed the vulnerability of the SF25? Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think this failure was a symptom of a major problem within Ferrari, or simply an unfortunate accident amplified by the context? And how do you think this will affect the season for Hamilton? Will it become the savior of the project, or this will be the beginning of a story that, like so many in Ferrari, will end in disappointment?